the next panel is entitled Dancing in the Museum. Deceptively simple. And I'm looking forward to hearing a group of panelists who I know will make it complicated for us. I'd like to introduce Kate Mattingly, who is pursuing her PhD in performance studies and is a perfectly well-positioned person to be moderating today. So Kate.
It is a pleasure to introduce our next panel, and our format will be that each of our panelists will speak for 20 minutes, then we'll have a response by Ralph Lemon, and then a question and answer session. And I thought that as moderator, I had a simple task of simply a brief biography of each speaker. Until a couple of days ago, I sent an email message to Jonah Bokaer, our first speaker, and within minutes, I received an email reply back, and in the subject line, it said, "Accurate Jonah Bokaer biography." And it began, career, author of 30 original choreographies, produced in, and then a list of 14 different countries. The next section, awards, was 16 lines long. The next section, museums, included a list of 13 institutions ranging from the Guggenheim in New York to institutions in France, Italy, and Switzerland. The next section, operas, included his recent work with Robert Wilson. The next section, media works, another long list, and then the last line, direct influences, which included the names Merce Cunningham, Deborah Hay, Tino Segal, among others. It was impressive, and what I especially admire about Jonah's work was something that wasn't included on the sheet, and that's his role in creating spaces for artists. He's the co-founder of the Center for Performance Research in Williamsburg, as well as one of the group of artists that established Shea Bushwick in 2002. So after Jonah speaks, we'll have Judy Hussie-Taylor, and she is the executive director of Danspace project in New York City, where she has created innovative projects, including the artist-curated platform series. She is also currently an advisor to the National Dance Project and an advisor to the new Institute for Curatorial Practice and Performance, which is at Wesleyan University. Prior to moving to New York, she was the executive director of the Colorado Dance Festival and a senior instructor at the University of Colorado in the Department of Art and Art History. And at the university, she was the interim director of the Visiting Artist Program, where she curated museum programs that included performance and photography. Following Judy, our third speaker will be Dr. Mark Franko, who is a professor of dance and performance studies at UC Santa Cruz, as well as the director of the Center for Visual and Performance Studies. He is the editor of Dance Research Journal, as well as the founding editor of the Oxford Studies in Dance Theory book series. His latest book, and this is the title, Martha Graham in Love and War, The Life and the Work, is forthcoming at Oxford this June. In 2011, he received the Outstanding Scholarly Research in Dance Award from the Congress on Research in Dance. And in 2013, he will be leaving California to move to Philadelphia to join the faculty of Temple University. The speakers will be followed by Ralph Lemon, who yesterday delivered our keynote, and I thought that it offered a glimpse of his incredibly beautifully crafted, intense, thought-provoking work, and it took me back to a moment 20 years before 1993. I just graduated college, and I was working at Jacob's Pillow Dance Festival, and a friend of mine had also just graduated from Princeton, and she was dancing with a company, and she strongly encouraged me to see the work. And it was there that I first encountered the Ralph Lemon Dance Company, and I believe that it was a piece called Their Eyes Rolled Back in Ecstasy. And it left an indelible impression, and it's been a fantastic journey to continue to see Ralph Lemon's projects that span from dance and choreography to writing and visual arts. So I continue to learn from, to appreciate your perspectives. Looking forward to the panel here, starting with Jonah.
Good morning. I'm so pleased to be with everyone here today and wanted to thank Laura, Shannon, and everyone who's put this together. I have a little bit of a secret, which is I'm a very nervous speaker. I'd much rather dance in this museum, but it's an honor to be here, so thank you. I wrote a brief text, and I'll be sharing about 50 images today, and it'll take about 20 minutes.
On this computer. Sorry, this is confusing.
This is my text.
Oh, your text. I'm sorry.
Sorry. No, it's all good. The transposition of ephemeral choreographic arts into visual arts institutions is not a new phenomenon. However, there are multiple discrepancies between current choreographic literacy and curatorial practice in the visual arts. This is increasingly evident when current choreographies become curated or presented in museums, galleries, or public collections. Dance taking up real estate in the museum or gallery is not the question. In actuality, choreographers are primarily concerned with the same questions as other exhibiting artists: space, visuality, temporality, and value. Issues of aesthetics, valuation, presentation, and their distortions can occur and are related topics when choreography is curated into visual arts contexts. I'm just going to be addressing this topic today as a choreographer. The framework that I'm using is to follow one work called Replica, which iterated over the course of about 4 years in a number of different museums. So we'll kind of dive in. Replica was a 2009 work. It actually was a duet between myself and a dancer, Judith Sanchez-Ruiz, who hails from Havana, Cuba. It was also a collaboration with visual artist Daniel Arsham. And we had the opportunity to make this work over the course of about a year in residence at cultural programs of the National Academy of Sciences. So we were supported through the provision of space and research as well. The work that I do with Daniel Arsham began in about 2007 when we began examining his visual arts practice in relationship to the body and often in three-dimensional exhibition spaces. This is a work called Hammock from 2007, Sheet from 2007 as well. And what's fascinating about Daniel Arsham's practice, he often questions the 6 walls, not only of a gallery space, but of a theatrical space as well, creating interventions into ceilings, walls, and floors. We stumbled across, we tackled a work of his from 2005 called 6 Erosions to the Center, which penetrates a cube from 6 directions. And we use this work as sort of the scaffolding or the concept behind Replica. So early studies involved a 3-to-4 ratio of the body to the cube. And Daniel actually proposed dominating the stage space with a very large cube. It ended up being about 10 feet tall. So this is sort of a build-out, early example, early model made out of plaster in his studio. And his premise was that 2 of the walls would experience some sort of a rupture or break during the course of the performance. And I worked with him to figure out in theatrical time when those ruptures would occur. So that was sort of the starting point for the piece, was the visual design that we used as a backbone for the work. The other thing I'd like to contribute or mention about Daniel's practice, which I think is very unique, is he is almost completely colorblind. And I think what this did is it gives him a phenomenal sense of depth perception for stage space, but also for gallery space, of course, too. So we quickly learned that the color scheme of the piece would be entirely in black and white, and that bodies as well as shadows would receive sort of a choreography through the space. So applying this sense of depth perception to the gallery versus the stage, of course, has different kinds of questions and problems depending on where it's occurring. The final component that I wanted to illustrate here is there's as a part of the design for this piece, the edges of the cube are extruded. So there's an extrusion which creates a floor pattern. And it's actually a very confined playing space, usually 20 by 20. And after the cube sort of divides the space, there are only 3 playing areas with a couple of simple lines on the floor. The first presentation space that this occurred was La Maison Carrée in Nîmes, and the Carré d'Art, which is the Norman Foster Museum, created directly in response to the Roman temple. The Roman temple here, the Maison Carrée, is it's a very resonant architectural location. It's also one of the, in my opinion, the most beautiful examples of the golden ratio in architecture. So what we did was we staged replica and installed it site-specifically in response to that architecture, but inside the foyer, designed by Norman Foster. So this is an atrium view. I think yesterday we touched a little bit upon what the occupational hazards are of presenting work inside of museums, and oftentimes they're open until 6 p.m. So if one is rehearsing inside a museum, it's just sort of even when does that happen, or what are the challenges around that? So this was a photo taken around 11 p.m. The proportions for this context, we actually redesigned the installation itself. So the figure, or our figure to replica, was created in proportion to the installation to the scale of the site itself. So we reconsidered that. This is an installation detail of, Daniel also had an exhibition inside of the museum at that time. So I think there were echoes of the works we've created sort of throughout the museum. This was curated by Françoise Cohen at the time. The work then traveled to the IVAM Institute in Valencia, which has a very, very different architectural configuration, and also there was an entirely different premise here as well. That premise was actually an exhibition called Confines, or Frontiers was sort of the other headline. This was curated by Robert Storr and Francesca Pietropaulo in 2009. And one of the topics I wanted to dive into is theatrical infrastructure, or lack of theatrical infrastructure at the museum. This presents visual, aesthetic, and very practical questions. Are there lights? Is there amplified sound? What kind of a floor surface does one dance on? Is it marble? Is it concrete? Is it a sprung floor? And also just practically, how does one plan for that, and how does, it really depends on how and who is organizing the exhibition. So in this context, we timed the performance to begin at sunset, and we decided, after a little bit of experimentation, not to go with amplified sound or light, or theatrical light. The performance then ended at sundown, and we positioned the public really just on one side of the cube. But what we found as well is that people kind of collected on the stairs or walked past and in behind our performance. So that was a kind of a cool and unplanned example in this iteration. This was set at very close range to the public. That's also another thing which we've been experiencing over the years now, is even something as simple as the floor or the line of the floor can broadcast very strongly to the public. Do you walk here? Do you not walk here? Is this a space for you, or is this now the performance space? So those questions about theatrical infrastructure communicate very strongly. Another premise of this work and of Daniel's design was that there would be no exits over the course of the 60-minute stage work, which also meant no wings in the traditional sense of a theatrical work. So that also had the sense of challenge and also collapse, because this cube, which dominated the stage, operated almost as a vacuum. So everything happening into and out of it animated the way that the performers enter and exit. We also had the opportunity to iterate this piece in Lower Manhattan. This was a part of the Sightlines Festival in 2009. And this had a very, very different architectural resonance, for sure. Even the logistic challenges of that particular presenter being able to accomplish this work was very difficult. There were certain plazas, buildings, or corporations which just said, no, we're sorry, we can't do the public performance. So locating the site was quite challenging. In this context, the ephemera remained after the performance. So what was fascinating was, after the 60-minute work, you would see maybe children climbing in and out or otherwise engaging with the work. And the work of Daniel Arsham is pretty, he tends to be very open-minded about people engaging with his art, so I give him a lot of credit on that level. The way that we oriented this work was to locate really the exact vertex of the site in terms of latitude and longitude. And we presented the corner of the work on that site as exactly as we could. Sort of going with the discoveries that we made by working with sunlight at IVAM, the position of the sun was used as the sole lighting source for this work. So that was sort of fascinating. In this photo, you can sort of see one side is effaced versus the other illuminated by sunlight. What we also discovered through rehearsals, which again were pretty challenging, there were a lot of, the business community was usually on a lunch break at that hour, so it was interesting. But the sunlight we determined would rake across the space at a 45-degree angle. So this is a photo of that, of the sun sort of combing across the space. And actually it was following this experience that we then realized a final iteration of the piece. We started to explore, at this point the work had been performed maybe 8 or 9 times, and we started to project images of the past performances from different architectural sites onto the surfaces of the cube, sort of as a way of tracing the history of the piece and asking the iterations of the piece to start to take a physical life in some way. So when we were approached by the New Museum to recreate this work, we decided to integrate a 2-channel video, also at 45 degrees, kind of an echo back to some of the iterations of the previous iterations of the work. So white box within white cube. I think we would have to make more time to kind of dive into that, but it was this particular location had a series of unusual and sort of ambiguous meanings, we felt. The New Museum's ground floor space, which I thought Malik very interestingly spoke about yesterday and his work there, it takes the paradigm of a black box theater, but it is in the basement of a white cube, sort of an institution. But the space is very peculiar. It's also completely, it's bleach white, and also the theatrical infrastructure, the iron pipes, lights, projectors, and AV equipment is also white. So that's also, that was not a part of our original planning for the piece, but we started to consider those elements as well, just down to, is the floor black or white, or how do we configure this? Actually the seating was quite site-specific, and even taking each viewer's perspective into consideration. So the edge of this cube and the edge of the room, we really tried to be as rigorous as possible with what the public was asked to see. The performance then expanded by 5 minutes, so 5 minutes on the front end and 5 minutes at the end. The piece begins with a 5-minute rewind of previous iterations of the work, and ends with another, but in reverse motion. This is an example of the visual artist Daniel sort of performing the first break of the wall, and the second example of that as well. The other thing that I wanted to present, sort of paradoxically, is we did light the work theatrically with traditional theatrical lighting, but this was inside the theater of the New Museum. And that also, we just found that by this point the work was almost kind of exfoliating or something. Just the iterations created such new resonance in each occasion. Another item which I think will lead to future realization too is LED theatrical lighting and how that sort of changes our understanding of color. I just wanted to contrast for a second. There have also been, following this, and actually following the iteration at the New Museum, I wanted to sort of contrast. There have been instances of replica presented in a proscenium space. Thanks. So this is an example, and already one can see the sort of the black theatrical the sort of grammar of a black box theater and how that changes the look and feel of the work. It also changes color as well. So that was something that we began to realize as the piece was continued to be performed. So I think I have about 5 minutes, but I wanted to zoom out for a second. The practice I've been trying to define and refine over about the past 10 years is turning towards there's been a lot of discussion about set and scenography in our dialogues these past few days, but actually using installation art and inviting or commissioning a visual artist to create an installation really as the fundamental scaffolding for choreography, and really saying that choreography is fundamentally depends on certain design elements. That's sort of where I've been working these days. So I wanted to just create a few examples of how that's been occurring. The design firm Snarchitecture did a work called Y Patterns a few years ago. Other works with Daniel Arsham, Recess, a recent solo. This is an example of a work done in a gallery in Los Angeles called Sequel, which was designed by Irit Batsri. This was a 2-channel projection system onto white walls. Recently, Anthony Goicolea also did an installation which formed the basis of a choreography. This was, in a way, one of our most challenging works, because the first thing that he did inside of a theatrical space was propose hundreds of candles. So, the theater sort of flipped out, and then the second thing that he did was spray trees with adhesive glue and gold leaf, and then theaters freaked out again. So it's sort of you always have there are these two. You always have to operate with a bridge when working across these media. I know time is scarce. I did have the opportunity to work on in the context of the 50-year retrospective of the Korean artist Lee Ufan, currently based in Kamakura, Japan. There was a very curious component of that retrospective, which was a piece called Things and Words from 1969. This was one of the few performative elements of the retrospective. So Things and Words involved 3 large sheets of Japanese paper and originally took place outside the Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum in 1969. With permission from Lee and also with a great deal of curatorial rigor, I was given the permission to reimagine this event as an act of choreography, which we titled On Vanishing. So that was sort of source number 1 for this work. The other source was Dialogue, a very sort of severe, imposing installation by Ufan on view in the rotunda of the Guggenheim, which involved 2 steel walls leaning against one another and 2 large boulders. So with those 2 sources, we used that source material as the scaffolding for a new 40-minute choreography. I wouldn't say that it was necessarily site-specific, although that is true. It was more occasion-specific, really, in response to an exhibition, in fact. So staging the body within that installation was sort of an act of supplication, in a way. And again, I just kind of wanted to flip us for a second. Clearly, there's always a lack of theatrical apparatus, so the way that one stages the public is usually very deliberate. We also had to research what the new kind of paper would be. And again, writing this choreography, we tried to create references and echoes which interpenetrated throughout the 50-year exhibition. And spectators were also staged very close to the public. So I think we're out of time here. But the sort of where we're at right now, present tense, myself and close colleagues that I work with, is can this work iterate or can it reappear? Lee Ufan recently had an exhibition at the Maison Jean Villard in Avignon, and we did reimagine the piece, but it was done as a solo rather than as a quintet, and actually with an entirely different sculpture, but from within the same body of work. So that's sort of the question. And I sort of leave us on a cliffhanger here because right now we're sort of wondering if there are, it's very present tense, is wondering what could the future life of this project be, if any at all. So thanks for the opportunity to exchange today.
Good morning. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks to everyone at Kate, everyone at ARC. I'm very honored to be here. I have about 10 minutes of talking, and then I want to get to some images of actual work in museums. But I'd like to begin by providing some information about Danspace Project. We are located in St. Mark's Church in the Bowery in the East Village. It's one of the oldest churches in the city, dating to Dutch colonial times. St. Mark's was built in the late 1700s on the old foundations of the New Amsterdam Governor's Family Chapel. Beginning in 1911, Reverend Norman Guthrie, a poet and professor of literature at the University of Chicago, was appointed as priest at St. Mark's. Guthrie sought to revive Sunday attendance by bringing in various artists for services and his lecture and performance programs. Isadora Duncan, Harry Houdini, Frank Lloyd Wright, Ruth St. Denis, Carl Sandburg, Khalil Gibran, all participated at one time or another. This is true. 2 generations after Guthrie's time, a new wave of democratization across the arts created a demand for small-scale downtown venues for film, theater, poetry performance, and dance. This resulted in the founding in 1966 of the St. Mark's Art Project, supporting a film collective, a black box theater, and the Poetry Project. This is how the church came to host performances by Sam Shepard, Carolee Schneemann, Joan Jonas, Leroy Jones, Jackson Maclow, Allen Ginsberg, Patti Smith, Merce Cunningham, John Cage, Meredith Monk, and hundreds more notable artists that I will not name here. That's the context behind the founding of Danspace Project in 1974 by the poet Larry Fegan and Barbara Lloyd Dilley, who was then a member of the groundbreaking dance collective Grand Union. It is against this backdrop or background that I want to situate Danspace Project's current mission to encourage risk-taking in dance and performance. We commission and present 20 to 30 new dance works annually. It's a lot. So 35 years into the history of Danspace Project, in 2008, I was hired as executive and artistic director, so it goes in most small dance presenting organizations. I learned dance performance curating during my almost decade-long tenure at the Colorado Dance and New Performance Festival, where the festival's founder, Marta Kern, and I presented a wide range of contemporary dance and performance work. In 1993, we presented Trisha Brown Company and collaborated with the University of Colorado Art Museum, then known as the CU Art Galleries, to exhibit photographs of Trisha's early equipment pieces with images by Peter Moore and Babette Mangolt. We also collaborated with the Denver Art Museum to show Burt Barr's Eros, a beautiful film documenting behind the scenes with the Trisha Brown Company during a European tour. This is but one of many projects and collaborations, but I mention Trisha because of her groundbreaking work creating dances for gallery walls, the sides of buildings, and rooftops. She opened up, for me and for many others, the endless possibilities of dance out of place. When I came to Danspace Project, my major challenge was to program and commission these aforementioned 30 commissions a year. That is a different company, artist, or choreographer every week for 30 weeks. It's a little overwhelming. It highlighted a major issue in dance presenting as I see it, especially in New York City, but I think throughout the country, which is that contemporary experimental dance was and is, for the most part, presented without the kind of curatorial support and contextualizing and archivable materials that we see in the visual art world. A dance presenter commissions an artist to make a piece. He or she is left to develop a work in virtual solitude, often with inadequate resources, most of the time, space, and time for development. The work is presented over a single weekend, without materials except the program, with little or no documentation, and the presenting organization moves to the next artist in the calendar. To address this, I designed a series of guest artist-curated multi-week platforms conceived as exhibitions that unfold over time. A platform is a set of performances framed by talks, panel discussions, and other materials that enable artists, scholars, and critics and audience members to pose questions about dance as history, form, and concept, and performance's relationship to a larger cultural discourse. I wanted to counter the factory-style production line of dance presentation in the US today. For each platform, I collaborate with an artist curator to contextualize the work being presented. This features the publication of a catalog, which is pretty much unheard of in dance, especially for a small, mid-sized organization like Danspace Project. We are also playing with the length of different events, performances, and our ancillary programming. For example, last fall, we presented 3 afternoon talks, Conversations Without Walls, co-organized by scholar Jen Joy and me. Each conversation was 3 to 4 hours long and included a wide range of guests from all artistic disciplines, museum curators, architects, filmmakers, poets, philosophers, theorists, and choreographers, of course. So, that's a little background. So to the question of the day, so why dance in museums? Why in churches, on rooftops, in gymnasiums, storefronts, lofts, parks, gardens, high school cafeterias? As a curator of dance, performance, and other live work on occasion, my practice is to pay attention not only to who or what work is being presented, but to how and where the work is being presented. Where the work is encountered informs how it is framed and ultimately processed. Curatorial and artistic attention to placement and or conscious displacement of a work of art, of any art, live or otherwise, offers the opportunity to challenge perception, to see, literally see the work differently. To curate time-based work is to query viewer expectations and assumptions about place, where they are, and time, how long they expect to be there. To present dance out of place is to take into account viewers' expectations and then upend them. This is the most challenging and perhaps exciting aspect of dance in museums, in my mind. Claire Bishop has written, "Perception is understood to be something mutable and slippery, not the function of a detached gaze upon the world from a centered consciousness, but integral to the entire body and nervous system, a function that can be wrong-footed at a moment's notice," end quote. She was writing about Karsten Haller, but it speaks to the situation we find ourselves in when we are in proximity to a live dancer or performer, which is often the case when we witness dance in a gallery context. We, the viewer, perceiver, share that mutable, slippery space with the live performer. We witness an individual, a human being, too often referred to in contemporary art as the body, executing actions and movements, but we are also in a rare situation to witness the dancer's intense focus. So perceiving perception is at work. The wrong-footed might be the slight wobble in a releve, the sweat, the breath, the foot or body slamming the floor. With this heightened awareness and tension between a high-powered mind and body in motion and our own wavering perceptions, we are sensitized to the slightest shifts of consciousness. Rigorous attention to context offers the opportunity to engage viewers in an experience that is, quote, integral to the entire body and nervous system. I probably don't need to say this if you're here, but I'll say it for the record, and Jonah just mentioned this, dance in museums is not new. It goes back at least more than 50 years, and as with many ideas across contemporary arts practice, dance in museums can be traced to John Cage, and it was born of necessity, the mother of invention. John Cage's father was, in fact, John Milton Cage, an inventor. Cage has written about his father. "My father was able to find solutions for problems of various kinds in the fields of electrical engineering, medicine, submarine travel, seeing through fog, and travel in space without the use of fuel." We haven't seen that yet. He told me, if someone says can't, that shows you what to do. During the first Merce Cunningham Company tour of Europe in 1964, Merce and John invented events in response to invitations to present work in museums. Original company member Carolyn Brown wrote in her wonderful memoir, Chance and Circumstance, quote, "In Vienna, we were scheduled to perform our work in the Museum of the 20th Century, but it had no theater. In order to present our work in this unconventional space, Merce and John created a special format, reminiscent of Cage's 1952 Black Mountain Happening. This format would serve the company to perform in almost any situation from New York's Grand Central Terminal to the Piazza San Marco in Venice. For want of a better title, he called the performance in Vienna Museum Event Number 1 in November 2004, although Jonah said it was 2003. 40 years later, event number 725 took place in Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern in London, and actually Jonah performed there. So now I've selected some performances that I've personally experienced in maybe not in the place where you'll see the work here today, but and just to give you some examples of dance in museums. And the first one I want to show you, this is Trisha Brown, Man Walking Down the Side of a Building. It was first performed in Soho in 1970. Many of you will have seen that, that wonderful image by Babette Mangold. It was not performed in the U.S. again until the Walker Art Center in 2004. And then it was performed at the Whitney by Elizabeth Streb and Stephen Petronio in 2010. And it's a 3.5-minute dance, so I thought we would watch it. I was reading, there's a wonderful exhibit and catalog, Dance Draw at ICA Boston, and Helen Molesworth, I think's essay talked about sort of a nostalgia about reperforming Man Walking Down the Side of a Building and other of Trisha's early equipment pieces. But I have to say, and I'm probably I actually like reperformances because I feel like looking at this stagnant image, which I've looked at for years, and experiencing that point where Elizabeth Streb or Stephen Petronio was like this, and that tipping point was unlike any experience I've ever had in my life in a performance, and it was a kinesthetic response. I had to go back again the next day and see it again. I find that often with much of Trisha's work that it's deceptively simple, and yet you want to see it again and to see it again. At least that's my experience. While we were watching this, this is at the Walker, but we were watching it outside the Whitney, and one of Trisha's former dancers, Shelley Sentard, whispered, "This is really a duet," because the man holding the rope at the top is actually helping the dancer, in this case he's a mountain climber, he's not a dancer, remain taut. So the idea is to not go slack, but to stay in that position. And of course these buildings are much higher than the original Soho buildings, so much further to go. We'll wait till he gets to the bottom. And of course, you probably couldn't do this on any building, especially in Soho, but you would have to do this at a museum because the insurance is outrageous, and the equipment is far more sophisticated than what Trisha was using in 1970. So an entirely different experience, but interesting nonetheless. We just have to see him hit the ground. So in 2009, Danspace Project co-presented a Performa commissioned Tacita Dean film Craneway event, 16 millimeter, 1 hour, 48 minute. This was the, Tacita Dean filmed 18 hours of a rehearsal in a Craneway in Northern California. I can't remember which town exactly, but where was it? Richmond. And so we have a film of Merce, and this actually premiered at Danspace Project in the church sanctuary. I think that's important because it's, and Tacita came and did a site visit, and we discussed, she wanted to know if Merce had performed there. I said, yes, indeed he had. And she built one of her special screens. So these are stills from the film. And this is really bad image, but this is inside the church, and she had a special screen built, which she does frequently for her work, a special wide anthropomorphic, is that the screen? And then there's Tacita and Trevor Carlson introducing the film, and then we had to build a special film projection booth in the back there. This floor is usually where we perform dance. So this then presents two things. One is a film of dance happening in a space that normally has live dance, as well as architecture within architecture. The architecture of the Craneway factory and the architecture of the church were sort of echoing or playing with one another. So pulling a work out of its established context, a theater, a black box, or vice versa from a gallery or theater into a performance space creates strange juxtaposition and offers new perspectives. MoMA's atrium is a surprisingly interesting space for dance, in my opinion. The pristine white box offsets the dancers in a visually compelling way. Also, the multiple levels offer perspectives absolutely unavailable on a traditional proscenium stage, where classical perspectives dictates where you should see the work, usually middle and center, which is how most choreographers are taught to make and present their work. So this is, again, Tricia Brown sticks. And just to show you I mean, if most of you have been to the atrium, but how many levels and places and spaces, and Tricia's work, I thought, worked beautifully in that context. And then you saw this yesterday. This is a part of a series, dance series that was organized around the exhibition online, and there were 4 dance performances in the program, including Ralph Lemon, Untitled, which we saw yesterday. But in terms of the seeing bit, I have to say we actually at Danspace didn't present, it was a private performance in the church of this duet, the first time Ralph and Oakley performed it. I was actually quite nervous about how it would play in a very public space and place, MoMA's atrium. But that is also where I was, I could actually see the work differently than I saw it at the church, and literally certain lines, and also the emotional weather, all kinds of things were reading very differently in this context, so I thought it was a pretty amazing experience. This is a not very good image, but another spectacular, and it was a spectacle, but it was a good one. If you're going to get yourself involved in spectacles, make sure they're really grand. And Meredith Monk certainly has done that. This is Ascension Variations, 2010, a synthesis of Songs of Ascension, 2009 and 10, with Juice, 1969, the Guggenheim. And I'm going to read a little bit from a piece that Deborah Jowett wrote about this. On November 7th, 1969, Monk presented the first part of Juice. The event and concept were amazing. Just 2 weeks shy of her 26th birthday, she had turned the entire landmark museum, its lobby, upward spiraling ramp, galleries, stairwells, nooks, crannies, and briefly the street outside into a stage. After almost 40 years, she returned to the Guggenheim to present Ascension Variations. We, spectators, cluster in the lobby and watch performers appear and disappear at various points in the tiers. Next, we stroll up the ramps along the way. So basically, we started as the audience where the performers are now, and and there are 80 performers in this piece. We end up spiraling up and reversing the situation, so we end up viewing the work finally from around the tiers with a choir. Extraordinary experience. And more recently, we have a historic moment with Sarah Mitchelson's and Michael Clark's inclusion in the 2012 Whitney Biennial. Sarah Mitchelson's Devotion Study Number 1, The American Dancer, was performed there just recently. Devotion Study Number 1 tested the dancer's limits. Relentless, perfect, and minimal, but rigorous movement pushed so hard their clothes soaked through in the first 15 minutes of the nearly 90-minute piece. The dancer's unflappable grace became the subject of the performance, in my view. The Blue Angel, as I refer to Nicole Manarino here, performed en releve with her arms straight out to each side for the full 90 minutes. She never left the performance space, which was a 4,000 square foot. It was the fourth floor of the Whitney, the entire floor almost, and they performed on a white stage with a blueprint of the Breuer building on the surface of the performance floor. The unrelenting choreography also tested the limits of the audience's body and mind. The following is a recent interview, just briefly, by Trajal Harrell and Sarah Mitchelson that was published by the Movement Research Performance Journal. Trajal asks, "What about working in a museum? How's that been?" Sarah, "Very wild and different. They were very unprepared, and me too. But everyone has been open and so have figured out most stuff, like having water in the museum, how to get to the toilet before showtime, the endless open hours when folk just come and stare at the dancers warming up, endless openings, grueling hours, then the gaze, so different than the theater." Trajal, "How long is the piece, or is it like a loop? How does time function?" "It's 1 hour and 20 minutes. Duration is something. But people sit and watch this whole thing? Yes. Or meander as if it's an art object? If they don't walk out, that is. People are walking out? Yes. But I am quite enjoying the tension between the dance audience, who are so committed in their seats and with their gaze, and the humph, what's this shit, of the art lover, uneducated in dance. Dance is difficult. It's fantastic in that way." This is, we saw this briefly in Peter's talk at the MCA's exhibit of Eiko Nkoma's retrospective. This was a little different. This is Eiko Nkoma performing a piece called Naked, 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 3 months. Was that? Just one, okay. And it speaks to proximity, as I mentioned before. Again, I'll read from Ewan Kerr from Minnesota Public Radio. He says, "Gallery visitors can come and go at will, but can sit just a few feet from where Eiko Nkoma lie naked." Eiko said, "While they don't look at the audience, they are very aware of being watched. She knows opening her eyes can be startling for the audience, and she has to be careful with every move. So part of the fatigue, I think, is mental, actually," she said. "Like, it's not people watching my face. They may be watching my cheek or behind my ears. And it's really delicious in a way as a dancer being watched that closely. But again, this is so close. It's a new experience for us. They have had audience members whisper to them. There was a gallery visitor who got down on the floor just inches away from them and rested there for a while just watching. The walker's Bart Ryan said many people seemed startled." And then I want to end with March 31st performance. Recently, as part of Danspace Project's Platform 2012 Parallels, curated by Ishmael Houston Jones, we commissioned Ralph Lemon to create a marathon event. Acutely aware of what an audience expects when they come to Danspace Project, the intention was, again, to upend those expectations. The result was Ralph's an all-day event, The End, which unfolded over 10 consecutive hours in a landscape inhabited by 7 sculptures by sculptor Neri Ward. Ralph invited 10 artists to create their own performance score, sound score, and to create a disguise. There were no rehearsals, and the performers encountered Neri Ward's sculptures for the first time only during the performance itself. Just go through some of these. That's David Thompson. And I'll just close with this, another piece of writing about this. Neri Ward has installed rolling interactive sculptures throughout Danspace. The work he has made to mark the end of Parallels, this platform exploring the idea of Black dance, is silver. I lean forward to see Jim Finlay's projections of words floating on the ceiling. They describe the invisible. I lean back and they disappear. The day feels dedicated to that most ephemeral, even in a field based on disappearance, place between creation and performance. The performers may be disguised, but to me, in their commitment and rough-edged sharing, they are naked. Separate performances echo one another across space and time. So, in closing, I'd like to say that not all dance is meant for museums, but by the same term, not all dance is meant for the stage. And as curators, our job is to discover the possibilities presented by an artist and together invent new possibilities for the work, especially as we are reminded by John Milton Cage, when we are told it can't be done, it shows you what to do. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shannon, for the invitation, and Michelle, and thank you, Laura and Sarah, for the wonderful organization and arrangements. Delighted to be here in such marvelous company. And I gave this paper a title. I got interested in thinking about Derrida's essay. I'll speak about it a little at the beginning, Signature, Event, Context. And then in going through the literature of institutional critique of museums, I came upon Adorno's essay, Valérie Proust, Museum. And I realized that any title to such a paper had to have 3 words. So this is my version of that. Not sure why that is, but we'll start on that note. What do we await from dance within the museum? Has there ever been, since, as several people have pointed out in this conference, dance in the museum is not a new phenomenon. Has there ever been such a thing as a museum dance? How do dance and the museum communicate? I take this term, communication, from Derrida's essay, Signature, Event, Context of 1972, where he interrogated the meaning of communication in the context of visual and performative instances of expression. Quote, "What is transmitted, communicated," he wrote, "does not involve phenomena of meaning or signification. Communication," he continued, "designates non-semantic movements. One can communicate, for instance, a movement or a tremor, a shock. A displacement of force can be communicated, that is, propagated, transmitted," end quote. What shock, tremor, or displacement of force does dance communicate to the museum? What shock, tremor, or displacement of force does the museum communicate to dance? If Derrida criticized speech act theory in this essay, that is Austin, in light of 18th century ideas of the origin of language, particularly Condillac, do we not find ourselves here today in a comparable situation? Perhaps that of art act theory instead of speech act theory, to echo on Rebecca's comments earlier. That is to say, we would switch the formula, Austin's formula, in saying something, I do something, to perhaps in doing, I museify myself. A comparable situation in which we seek to understand some continuity or points of contact between the old pedagogical and didactic as well as documentary project of the museum in the context of the lively, phenomenal presence of contemporary dance. This is one starting point. But I have another starting point drawn from a few examples. The phenomenon whereby a particular site is articulated by the movement performed within it, or wherein movement takes on a specific dimension and meaning by virtue of the site in which it is performed. I think this is quite well known as a phenomenon, but perhaps demands further exploration. This is just an image I took recently at Versailles of a friend of mine, Christine Bael, doing a performance, very, very wonderful and precise work on Baroque dance, but within the context of Versailles, which is something of a museum in itself. And bringing a museum to life, so to speak, through a performance assumes a hidden life, presumes a hidden life in the collection, and makes of the collection an environment which criticism of the museum has long reproached museums for lacking, particularly Adorno. Quite literally, movement brings life to the collection, restores life to the objects that have been severed from their original physical and cultural locations. In this case, the physical and cultural location of movement itself in historical time. This is not simply a question, so by association then, an association between absent movement and a collection of material objects. This is not simply a question of historical reenactment, although it has connections to that phenomenon, to which I shall return later. It is a phenomenon I've noted recently in the work of Belle, L'Éclat des Muses, but also this is a piece of Donia Foyer from 1967, Et Spel, a piece for a museum done in the Historiska Museet in Stockholm, which in the section which is devoted to rune stones, so really to prehistoric Swedish culture. She did several others. This was also an intermission in which the children in the audience were asked to commune with the rune stones. In this work, Foyer used the rune stones of the museum to reflect on pre-bourgeois aspects of contemporary Swedish society. This was another one she did there, Vargrop, the crying of the wolves. And then so this is in the 60s, right? I'm not going back as far as Schlemmer or Liszewski or the Bauhaus, but I mean, this is an ongoing thing, as several people have pointed out. Something I myself did in 1994 at the Getty Museum of Antiquities in Santa Monica, a piece called Operatics, in which I had many of the experiences that Jonah and others were describing with museum personnel, and I chose certain images just to point out the proximity of the dancers to these ancient sculptures and the kind of freak out, of course, potential that had for the museum staff. The idea in this piece, a little bit, just briefly, it was a piece that had already been done elsewhere in a theater, but it was about opera, and so it was about this kind of audience. The dancers were an audience who were aspiring to a certain expressive magnification of movement that could never be really achieved. So what was interesting to me in transporting this into the Getty Museum was the way in which, starting with Bizet's Carmen and ending with Gluck's Alceste, was the way in which opera glommed onto these art objects. We were surrounded by these antiquities. And in some way, they got mobilized as another figure of this kind of hyper-expressive, also because of the mimetic scale of these objects. They were really to scale of the bodies in very interesting ways. So it was quite a marvelous experience. And this was just another. I won't go on too much about this piece, but I just wanted to share that with you for a moment. So some experience that I've had of this that doesn't go back to the foundational moment of Schlemmer, if you like, nor does it particularly become exhausted in the current fad for performance in the museum. But then I went to the Whitney Biennale to see Michael Clark the other week to think about this conference and this paper. And I saw Who's Zoo, and the very large fourth floor gallery space that Judith just mentioned at the Whitney was used, redesigned to look and feel like a performance studio. The audience sat on the floor along one wall during the 45-minute show. As they were not scattered throughout the space, but assembled in a line at one end of it, they maintained the mutual anonymity characteristic of a theater audience. The space marked out for dancing was quite wide, although not comparably deep, and two entranceways framed the back wall symmetrically to act as wings for the performers. A laser-like lavender line cut horizontally across the back wall, joining the two entranceways. The walls were white, the dance floor was black. A lighting grid in the ceiling rendered the technical lighting apparatus unobtrusive, as in most theaters, while providing the capability of professional lighting effects. Apart from the challenge of crowd management briefly imposed on the museum staff, I was unaware of being in a museum. And I think Joe Good mentioned a similar phenomenon in some experience of his as well. I don't have the time to enter into further details about this piece itself, except to note that the title and the choreography suggested that the dancers were animals in a zoo, Who's a Zoo, implying they were also paired in certain ways, and their costumes contributed to that effect, implying a critique of museum culture that would make the dancer the colonized group on display. This seemed underlined by the use of untrained performers, alongside professional dancers, and the pairing of dancers in costumes that identified them as two or three of a kind. Clark evokes the ethnographic past of the museum. As Mika Ball points out, the critique of the museum is motivated chiefly from the ethnographic perspective, and Who's Zoo seems to present dance knowingly as a museum artifact. But it does so in a space that is trying very hard not to be museal. Clark seems to be forcing the museum to be that which it no longer wants to be. If the museum is, historically at least, as Tony Bennett reminds us, a rational and scientific project that documents and explains material and visual culture, the presence of danced performances in its galleries points to the intrusion of the oral into the sphere of visual and material culture. This could also be viewed from the perspective of time. The museum, in Foucault's terms, is, quote, a sort of perpetual and indefinite accumulation of time in an immobile place, whereas dance spends time, takes time in a way that simulates the presence of being. As William Forsythe has said, quote, I am inclined to believe that because we are bodies and possess perceptive mechanisms, we also have time. I suspect our ability to construct time is predicated on the manner in which the body integrates its perceptions and upon the action necessary to generate these perceptions, end quote. The experience of time for Forsythe would be impossible without the lived body. As he points out, the body's actions generate perceptions. And hence it becomes clear why dance is often considered as purely durational, whereas the museum is considered static, despite its imposition of a choreographic path on the visitor. How then does what I'm calling, following Derrida, the presence of being, communicate, in his sense, with the question around communication as a sort of opening onto, communicate with a guided itinerary through the display of a time past, organized to a didactic end, with space as a metaphor for historical time or movement, progression. It's as if, with Hu's zoo, the spatial and display qualities of museality are institutionally and curatorially resisted. If, as with Huzu, the spatial and display qualities of museality are institutionally and curatorially resisted, then any such communication touching each other between these two ideologies of image and act is aesthetically, critically, and historically evacuated, in my opinion, from the encounter. At the other end of the spectrum, indicated by Clark's work at the Whitney, we could locate Boris Charmatz's project, Musée de la Danse. In taking over the Centre chorégraphique national de Rennes et de Bretagne, Charmatz proposed to eliminate the terms center, choreographic, and national, replacing them with the title Musée de la Danse. In his manifesto for a museum of the dance, which you can find online, Charmatz makes the following important claims. Actually, I have the text here in French, but I'll translate. We are at a moment of history where the museum can be alive and inhabited just as is a theater, where it can include a virtual space and offer contact of a practical, aesthetic, and spectacular nature with dance. And then the second proposition, we're at a moment in history where the museum in no way excludes precarious movements, nor does it exclude nomadic, ephemeral, or instantaneous movements. And then thirdly, we are at a moment in history when a museum can change both the idea that one has of a museum and capitalize the idea that one has of dance. This is what this manifesto looks like online. Implicit in Charmatz's discourse is that dance contains within itself the universal conditions of its own possibility to transform poverty into wealth. I'm thinking here in Adorno's terms of extreme poverty and extreme wealth. Adorno, in his critique of the museum, said that the museum assembles an extreme wealth of objects and transforms them to the viewer into extreme poverty. The most nomadic, ephemeral, and instantaneous gesture has the power to create its own space, to become a museum in its own right. Indeed, to institute its own space no longer as one of guided tours, behavior regulation, and initiation into citizenship, with which the museum is identified since the 19th century, but rather of autodidacticism, a space in which one can experiment, learn, test, and freely experience with one's own body. Dance in the presupposed space of the museum becomes, by virtue of this collocation, an emancipatory procedure. This is practically the reverse of Paul Valéry's comment that when faced with the vast accumulation of objects, he, man, is impoverished by the very excess of his wealth. This was the quote that Adorno drew upon. Adorno saw Valéry's comment as critical of the museum's false wealth, the term he used, embodied in its accumulation of artifacts. The wealth of museum collections is productive of extreme poverty, whereas the poverty of dance is productive of extreme wealth. Clark and Chalmats, therefore, are extreme examples. The first stops short at the simple fact of a performance in a museal space. The second enters into a utopian vision of dance as a museum, inspired in part by Jacques Rancière's Le Maître Ignorant, the ignorant schoolmaster, which is sort of philosophically underneath this. La force d'un musée de la the power of a musée de la danse, specifies Chalmats, exists in the very fact that it doesn't exist. So this is, in that sense, that indicates the utopian project. Chalmats belongs to a critical tradition that sees the museum as a utopian project, quote, a refuge for things and people, literally a building dedicated, here I'm quoting Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblet, who has a much more positive view of the museum than does Adorno. A refuge for things and people, literally a building dedicated to the muses and the arts they inspire, a space in which to muse, to be inspired. The museum puts people and things into a relationship quite unlike anything encountered in the world outside. So how to, in other words, generate that experience without those walls. So let us return to the question. Between the museum and dance, what communicates? While the answer to the first part of the question appears self-evident, the transformative power of the museum for dance appears at first glance less evident. I'd like to linger for a moment on how Chalmats's consideration of the Musée de la Danse as an open, polyvalent space leads to the mutual transformation of both museum culture and dance culture. Behind the Musée de la Danse project is an earlier one Chalmats has discussed in a book called Je suis une école, I'm a school. And this brings forth thoughts that Andrew Weiner in the first session evoked when he spoke of self-organized education, collective experiencing. This book of Chalmats has obvious connections to the issue of education generally, to the question of dance pedagogy and training that are quite particular to France, to be certain, but a sense of the contemporary dancer as autodidact emerges from recent debates in France over dance technique and from the interventions of Chalmats in that debate. The pedagogical issue of the museum encounters the pedagogical issue of dancer training. How do we become a good citizen? How do we become a good dancer? How does the dancer belong to the state? Particularly clear in the French context, of course, where things are so set up that way. The ways in which museums, for Bennett, devise ways of regulating the conduct of their visitors, quote, and deal with crowd management, a trait with broader implications for behavior management, have a direct connection to the state-authorized pedagogical trajectory of the professional dancer, particularly in France. The transformative potential of the Museum for Dance in Chalmats's view resides paradoxically in its very educational project, although that project must itself be radically reinvented by dance itself. One way Chalmats has proposed this choreographically is, as Noémie Solomon has recently analyzed it, to, quote, strangle time. In the first project of the Musée de la Danse, his Préfiguration, 2009, Chalmats staged a whole night of performance works that were slowed down. As Solomon notes, quote, by performing a radical slowing down of movement, the event might be seen as an attempt to press together the apparently contradictory terms of dance in the museum until their respective codes, techniques, and concerns become attached in a knot, end quote. As Forsyth also pointed out, movement is the instrument of time as experience. Its actions generate the perceptions necessary to the experience of time itself. So this strangulation of time is in a certain sense a coagulation, but not a coagulation into the commodity that Rebecca evoked earlier, not coagulation of the dancer's labor into a commodity, but rather the experimentation with this form of communication between dance and this museal space. This transfer of the contents of the museum, or let us say of the archive quite simply, into dance and the body is also characteristic of the tendency in contemporary dance toward historical reenactment. And I'd like to end with some comments on that phenomenon. A phenomenon which has had obviously a relationship to curatorial practice, particularly in the Abramovich work at MoMA, but actually also exists quite autonomously within the contemporary dance field. Has really nothing, in my view, nothing to do with museums except in a conceptual nature, in as much as one would. Is that total time or means I have little time? Okay. Okay, I just want to conclude with a few remarks on this. There's been talk of late of the body as an archive, and I published a lot of these articles in DRJ, so I'm very aware of them partially that way. How is the body a museum? What would a museum of choreography look like? The two questions seem related as reenactments collect and exhibit dances past by and through what Fabien Barba, who you see here, calls corporeal research. This is him doing his presentation of Mary Wigman's American tour of 1930-31, in which there are all kinds of theatrical techniques to both distance and engage us, such as programs left on seats, the original program, and a more contemporary program of the performance. So I'd like to conclude with a few works about the phenomenon of reenactment. It seems to me that despite quite a bit of disparate activity, a common trait of this is the refusal to impersonate a previous artist. This is significant in dance, where the artist's work to be reenacted is in most cases inseparable from the body of that artist, especially in the tradition of modernism. What comes out of this particular refusal to impersonate the predecessor, in conjunction with these methodologies of theatrical distancing and a rejection of all convictions about absolute repeatability, a rejection of the artifactual nature of the reconstruction, is a sensibility, paradoxically, for the objective nature of choreography itself. That is to say, the implication of much contemporary reenactment in the dance field is that past choreography exists in space. It actually continues to survive in space, or we could say in potential space, to borrow from Winnicott, and can be recovered through specific spatial or even display practices. As Forsyth has written about what he calls choreographic objects, quote, could it be conceivable that the ideas now seen as bound to a sentient expression are indeed able to exist in another durable, intelligible state, end quote. Reenactment stages the recovery and, in this sense, the acquisition of actions. And this is perhaps some answer to the questions about the acquisition of actions that have been raised during this conference. Reenactment provides a time-based model of museality, which makes me think of Deep Rivers, also the project in which the institutional model of the museum is transformed into a time-based model, 5 years only. If the objectality of choreography still remains to some degree elusive, it is nonetheless true that there is a movement afoot to uncover its materiality rather than its ephemerality. And in respect to this project, which is barely beginning, the concept of the museum, if not its physical and cultural reality, is crucial. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonah and Mark and Judy. And this is going to be redundant, all of this. Very stimulating. And, you know, for me, and I imagine for most of us here this weekend, it's all we have are really questions. So I just have a few more that arose from listening to you all. And then, you know, the arc of them might not be really linear, so bear with me. You know, as an artist, the question of the intentionality of an artist entering a particular kind of space is something we haven't really discussed. Do you know? Like the agency, you know, the power of transgressing where someone belongs or doesn't. The artist addressing a body movement material versus the artist primarily focused on the object as potential. And And this really interesting question Jonah brought up about spaces with theatrical infrastructures versus spaces without. The kind of politic of a space and where that is beneficial or confusing or generative. Do you know? I think, again, getting back to that question of intentionality and an artist needing to know kind of what they're up for and if that's possible. Which brings up this interesting question for me of how might we begin to talk about, if we haven't already, the theatricality of a museum space, which I feel is certainly present. The color currency of theater versus museums, black versus white, both colors addressing a kind of absence. And in the case of the white space, referencing Melville, Moby Dick, you know, a color representing abomination. That was sort of a nice little play that arose for me, Joan, in your sharing. Our codes in eliminating terms, choreography, architecture, design, directing, installing, curating. These definitions seem to be breaking down, perhaps collapsing. Is it important to maintain these distinctions in our creative play? I feel like we're all creatively playing around something here. And I guess I mean that internally, because externally the larger dominating systems who pay us to play need to define and distinguish what it is that we do. But that we as the doers, do we need these particular kind of definitions? Is it useful? The promiscuity of art practices moving from dance spaces to churches to galleries to museums, as has been mentioned throughout the weekend, this has been going on for some time. So what are we really talking about? Well, one issue for me that's really interesting is the question of value. And I don't mean the obvious value of, or the obvious that there's a lot of money in the museum visual art world, sort of, versus the little money in the theater and dance world. If economy is the new sacred, then the currency of spirit is now completely ensconced in the economy in exchange, the commodification of happiness, love, and the body. Is that the case? And if so, then what? There's also the evaluation of the audience, the art crowd, the theater crowd, the dance crowd, these particular armies who have a particular agenda about what they want to see or what they expect, you know, in looking at a particular kind of work material. Mark, you brought up this great question of disruption, shock, and there's an essential, in my creative practice, it seems an essential element of disruption as innovation. It's absolutely essential, this shock. But what is the difference between, you know, aleatoric, accidental disruption versus institutionalized disruption, as in, let's bring a dance to a museum space? Or even better, let's give Sarah Mitchelson a Whitney Prize, a Whitney Biennial Prize worth $100,000 and a solo exhibition in the museum. That was just announced a couple of days ago. As a choreographer, there's something very transformative about that, but also dangerous. And Sarah's a good friend of mine, and I emailed her congratulations, and she wrote back, "I'm sick with fear." And she's sick with fear because it's not a theater. And yet her work has been moving in that direction of meta theater, right? I think the primary question for most artists is, what are the opportunities for transformation? And I would agree with Boris Shimotz on that. And then I think in that it becomes an open field of where we can find that. And it seems to me that the spaces then become just opportunities for finding it. So that's my opening, and you guys can take it over.
Do you need the microphone?
Would you like to make a response?
Well, I would just say thank you. It's wonderful. Yeah, just 2 points you made that resonate with what I was thinking as well. Also, as in my experience as a choreographer, precisely, even not as a critical theorist now, but that you mentioned the theatricality of the museum space, and indeed, I mean, once one assumes that is the challenge of that space, as one would almost any space, one is in a realm where that becomes part of one's theater, so to speak, and I think that's crucial. And in that sense, there's no estrangement. As you say, you separate, which I think is so brilliant, you separate out the experience of the artist from the experience of the curator in that instance. That is, the artist is not self-experiencing as a curator. They have not arrogated to themselves the role of curation. They are simply exploiting the theatricality of the space that they are in. And that makes perfect sense to me. As you said at the end, space becomes an opportunity for finding something. So I just wanted to underline that, because I think that's what's most interesting to me about this. That is why this is not a new thing, actually. What's new about it is the economics of it, and the career aspects, perhaps, of it, and also the impact it is having on curatorial practice, indeed, and the anxiety around that as well.
Ralph, one of your comments reminded me on something that was written in the drama review, like maybe it was a year ago, about it talked a lot about language, but also about distinction between kinds of space, be it and really that the language, where it can be useful, and where it breaks down. When we say theater and performance and visual, the kinds of theatrical spaces are, it almost, for my taste anyway, it's not nuanced enough. Is it a proscenium theater? Is it an opera house? Is it a black box theater? Is it a white black box theater? Is it Italianate? Is it Versailles? To really, whatever topic or work we're confronting, I end up on the side of the spectrum where I do think the language can be a useful tool, but also we have to be careful of the binaries, at least from my point of view. This particular article in the drama review was about black box theater versus proscenium theater. So it was just internal to proscenium theatrical spaces and how nuanced they can be and how different. So.
Yeah, there's an article by Peggy Phelan in the Move Choreographing You catalog, the exhibit that was at the Hayward Gallery in London last year. And I'm paraphrasing her, but it had something to do with the history of dancers, women, and people of color being marginalized over and over and over again. And so something that I think about and didn't mention in my talk has to do with politics of placement, the politics of proximity to a moving being, person. And so, I think for many of us coming out of contemporary dance or art, MoMA is our center, or the large institutions are the center. So I think that what the dancers and choreographers I know that are interested in moving into that center are also equally trying to reclaim or maintain their power within the very tight controls of the space, and they're necessary controls, but and there's a fear, or it has been for years, and I'm curious about this dance that's going on now between visual art curators and choreographers, a fear of the messiness. And in fact, a lot of the work I showed was very pristine. I was pretty aware of that, and looked quite beautiful. And actually, I chose examples of things that I thought worked visually and on many levels. But really, what we're talking about when we're talking about the body, we start to enter into all kinds of messy areas, sexuality, falling down. That's why I said I was nervous and wondering how Ralph and Oakley would play in the atrium, because they're on top of each other and they're kissing, and it's as Sarah says, it's difficult. It's fantastically difficult. So I'm curious when that will be like, that's enough. We've had enough. It's a little too messy. We don't want to go any further. Just a question, will Meat Joy be performed in the atrium?
I wonder if we want to open it to questions from the audience. Yes, a couple of hands are already up. Peter?
Yeah, so thanks. That was all really great and interesting. I was, a question that responds a little bit to the word you used, Mark, reenactment, in relation to bodies. And I was watching a YouTube thing last week of Yvonne Rainer teaching Trio A to Martha Graham, which was kind of an improbable notion, but it was really Richard Move as Martha Graham, and it's funny and pointed. And then seeing today your clip of man walking down the side of a building on this beautiful edifice of Herzog de Meuron building, knowing how different that is as a publicly staged event to doing it on a Worcester Street alley up on a 4-story brick building going down to a cobblestone street. It's just like a completely different thing. So I think of 3 different examples that relate to bodies from recently restaged dance works. One is Echo and Coma's performance for the concert stage. It's 3 early works, 2 very early works and one more recent work. The 2 early works are from the mid-'70s, Night Tide and White Light. And their work in particular is about, and has become in pointed ways over 40 years, about degeneration, change of body, loss, getting closer to the earth, becoming more part of nature. And the title that they gave to that program of early works that were restaged and danced by themselves with their now old bodies is Regeneration. Another project that I thought of is Ishmael Houston Jones's piece with Dennis Cooper and Chris Cochran, Them, which I saw not when it was originally staged in the 80s, but a couple of years ago. And I had a very personal experience feeling that there was something, despite my being a big fan of all of those artists' work and having great anticipation about seeing this, finally getting to see this piece, I felt somehow disconnected or even cheated because the young men who were dancing didn't have the right bodies. They didn't have the bodies that the men whom I knew in the 80s in New York had when they were living those movements that were being somehow captured in the piece. And a third example is Lucinda Child's work Dance, which of course has a duet in it between Solowitz's film and the live dancers. And when in its restaging in the last couple of years, the dancers are no longer the dancers in Lucinda's company who danced in that film in 1979, but contemporary dancers. And in a somewhat analogous way, Lucinda's dancers now, who are in a very poignant kind of duet with dancers who are now in their 60s, also are dancers who are trained with different bodies. They don't have the they have much more training, in a sense, than the dancers who were in Lucinda's company then. And so when I think about, or when I wonder about restaging, I also wonder about this term reenactment, which makes me think instantly of theme parks or George Saunders' Pastoralia or something like that, where people go to historic Williamsburg or play as though they're soldiers in civil wars, things like that. So I feel like reenactment is the wrong word right away, but on the other hand, I think, well, yeah, if there's different bodies doing it, maybe it is reenactment. And I wonder whether anybody could talk about that in relation to...
I could say a few things, maybe to start. Yeah, we did a whole series on, we call Temporalities of Reenactment at Center for Visual and Performance Studies at Santa Cruz last year, and we're continuing it a bit next year as well. So this is what you point out, these are some of the big issues around the difference between reconstruction and reenactment. It's not a lot of time to develop it, but I think his Civil War example is important, because Martin Puchner came and gave a talk on reenactments, and he pointed out that what reenactment generally is, in that context of let's redo a Civil War battle, there is no mimetic illusion involved in it. There's in fact a decision not to perform, not to create a mimetic reproduction of the original. And the way in which that could be related to the danced reenactments we're seeing is, it seems to me, there's always a bit where, invariably, reenactment may not be the right word. There are tons of different words we could use, and not even all these artists use this word, so I don't mean to put this label on it. But if you look at Fabien Barbat, for example, when he redoes Mary Wigman, it's obvious, first of all, that he's a man, and yet he's doing it with this historical rigor. And, in terms of the right body or the wrong body, he has done remarkable research. So I do what he calls corporeal research that is extremely dense, and I think that when you hear him talk about it, it is amazing. So there is this question of the historical body or the morphology of a body that has changed, or a training system that has changed, but at the same time I think what makes reenactment not reconstruction, not that failed idea, is the very refusal to assume that mimetic relationship to the original. But the magical thing that happens when it's well done is, in fact, one realizes that one doesn't need Isadora Duncan present to do this dance, but that the work itself has an autonomous identity. And that's where it becomes something of an object. That's why Forsyth talks of the choreographic object. And that is something I've experienced directly. In other words, it's a haunting feeling. It's not that it's fully present. It comes in and goes out. But I think that's part of the quality of what we're seeing in contemporary work in this direction. And so, but it's happening outside the museum, and I think that's interesting too, because once you get as Kate pointed out to me, there's a new project of Schalmatz in Karlsruhe called Moments, A History of Performance in 10 Acts, in which he's actually moving toward reenactment with some of the original players like Anna Halprin. And, but what happens when you get reenactment actually situating itself in a museum? You get this kind of overdetermination of the concept of a pastness that's going to return. So I think that is an interesting development. But I think the whole issue of this authenticity of the original versus the distance of that of a reenactment from that original, especially if you are a historical witness yourself, is something we have to deal with. But then what comes to fill that void are all these theatrical methods to in fact distance us from the need for that authentic original in order to experience the work not as tied to the modernist artist personality or that mythical past, but in fact to the autonomy of choreography itself as artifact.
I just want to say two things quickly about that. We described two different modes of performing or reenacting. One is where the choreographer themselves decide to remount or reprise a work. And the other is when another performer, artist, goes in to reclaim a work or reclaim a sense of history. And, that is for better, there are better examples, but I think it has to be strange enough, like you're saying. Fabian is clearly a man, and there has to be some underlying historical, conceptual, scaffolding is the word that's been used today, in order to make that work or viable. But when it's the choreographer themselves, or even performance artists, I hear sometimes, well, they shouldn't do that. Marina shouldn't re-perform. It was not the same as Ulaya Marina. Or Trisha Brown shouldn't have done the rooftop piece at MoMA. Or, I wonder about that language around when it's live work, when it is, in fact, two women using their own body as material. Who says? Do they need permission? I mean, that's whether your critiques are valid as an experiencer, a viewer of the work. But I've just listened to that language a lot, and I think it speaks to this issue of agency. And
I have something to contribute to the topic of reenactment, but actually not from, well, maybe a little bit from dance. The politics of reenactment around Thin Blue Line, the documentary film, I think offer a lot of, I think the legal precedents in that case were very interesting. And then also I always try to turn a corner somehow. I think about my own anxiety about the topic, but then I think about as well the, it's just recent, but the Merce Cunningham Trust, in which works are licensed. There are very clear frameworks and parameters. So just to give one example, the LA Dance Project is licensing Winter Branch, even from 1964, even though none of the ephemera exist. Rauschenberg is not there to restage the detritus in the theater, and it's so long as it's coherent with what's in the trust, there are parameters set in place for that to occur. So it's sort of a, again, maybe it has to do with language, because dance and theater companies restage their works all the time, but reenactment tends to have a different epistemological meaning.
I want to say thank you to the panelists. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I'm hoping that we can continue these conversations during lunch, perhaps, or during the next break. But thank you to Ralph, to Judy, to Mark, to Jonah.